The coronavirus pandemic puts further pressure on some of the world's lowest paid workers. With more countries imposing lockdowns, many people without sick leave or stable income say they cannot afford to stay at home. So how should they be protected? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Maryam Nemazee. The world is experiencing unprecedented events right now as the coronavirus pandemic affects the lives of millions of people. Governments are putting cities into lockdown and they are urging everyone to avoid public spaces and to work from home if possible. But many low-paid workers around the world don't have that option. As shops and restaurants are deserted, people face weeks without pay. The shutdown is affecting the so-called gig economy, a growing sector in many countries. And those who are couriers, rideshare drivers and the self-employed say they can't afford to miss work because many of them don't get sick pay or medical insurance. Well, some companies have started to take action, but workers are already saying it's not enough. Ride-sharing firms Uber and Lyft say they'll compensate drivers affected by the crisis for up to 14 days. UK delivery business Hermes says it's setting up $1.2 million to compensate its 15,000 self-employed couriers if they have to self-isolate. Several tech companies announced contract workers would still receive full pay despite a potential decreased need for their services. And then chains like Starbucks and Walmart have temporarily updated their sick leave policies and are urging shift workers to stay at home if they show symptoms. But there are fears companies whose revenues are affected could struggle to protect their workers. So let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Nottingham here in the UK, Greg Howard. He is a delivery driver for various apps like Deliveroo, but is currently in self-isolation at home. In Boston, Massachusetts, Shannon Liss-Riordon, an attorney who's represented many gig economy workers. And then here with me in the studio, Vicky Price, Chief Economic Advisor at the UK-based think tank, the Centre for Economics and Business Research. A very warm welcome to you all. And Shannon, if I can start with you, because we are now seeing the coronavirus pandemic really exposing existing social and economic divisions. And there's sort of two aspects to this, isn't there? The vulnerability of gig economy workers and service industry workers could deepen the crisis. We'll talk a bit more about that later. But the crisis itself could increase vulnerability as well. How important is it to have paid sick leave?
It's extremely important, and I think this crisis is highlighting the problem more than ever now. We're hearing public health experts urging everyone to engage in social distancing, and also the most important rule is that if you're feeling sick, you need to stay home. But the problem is that gig economy workers only get paid when they work. If they don't show up to work, they're not going to be able to put food on their own table and pay their own rent. So we need to get paid sick leave for them so that they can stay home. These workers are on the front lines of this crisis right now. We have Uber and Lyft drivers who are driving people to places they need to go because they don't want to take public transportation, particularly right now. We have food delivery drivers bringing Postmates, DoorDash, Grubhub.
And actually, on that note, you speak about food delivery drivers.
They don't want to eat out.
Yeah, I want to go to Greg in that case, because you are actually the dilemma that Shannon was describing for us there. You are confronting that head on right now. You've worked for Deliveroo and Uber Eats. Now you're in self-isolation. Tell us about why you've decided not to work.
So the reasons I've decided not to work essentially is I'm a risk to those that I deliver to. So we are the front line in providing those that are in self-isolation, those that are in quarantine, not just in the UK but across the world, with basic supplies, food, hot food deliveries. We're going to see soon if the elderly in this country, in the UK, are isolated, forced into quarantine. We may be doing more and more deliveries to those people as well. So I've self-isolated based on the government's advice. For a period of 7 days as I was displaying symptoms for my sake and also for the public's sake as well.
Can I ask, when did you start to feel poorly?
On Thursday, just gone.
And now you're at home.
I am at home now, yes. Yeah, I've been at home.
And that's here in the UK, that's been the government's advice, hasn't it? As you start to get any symptoms, even if they're cold-like, that you immediately self-isolate. And so, Vicky, just hearing there from Greg, I mean, self-employed workers are not eligible for statutory sick pay. And actually, there are tens of thousands of workers like this, couriers and drivers, who are not going to get paid to do what Greg is doing.
That is true. Of course, there are some firms that have taken the view that perhaps they can give them something, even though they're self-employed and work for them on a contract basis. So it's not everywhere that is the case. But of course, what the government in the UK has said is that if you are part of that big group of self-employed or part of the gig economy, you can actually access benefits from the welfare state. Now,
those long and laborious.
Absolutely, it takes
accessible.
a long time. But let's not also over-exaggerate the importance of sick pay, because statutory sick pay in the UK is one of the lowest as a percentage of average earnings than practically any other country in the EU. So you get 20% of the average. Can you imagine if anyone is earning more than that and they just get £94
so the UK's
a week?
Performance on this is what, the worst?
It's one of the worst. I think there's only one other country, if I remember correctly, that's worse. And I can't remember which one, I have to say right now. But actually, it is pretty poor. And something needs to give, really. There's no way in which you can treat a whole part of our working population that way. And the estimates are that possibly 1 in 10 workers in the UK has worked on some sort of platform using digital and so on, so they can be described as part of the gig economy, even though the overall estimates may be that maybe we have 3 million people who are part of that.
But it's a growing part of the economy, because
yes,
we're seeing really the growth of these companies, more and more people using their services. That could increase actually with some of these social distancing measures. Again, that's something I want to, we'll get into that in a bit. Shannon, worth taking a look at the existing system before this coronavirus pandemic, isn't it? Because across the United States, lowest paid workers are excluded from paid sick leave and livable wages. Many Americans also don't have health insurance, so people can't afford to stay at home, can they?
Yeah, that's right. And one country that's doing worse than the UK is the United States. We don't have any national paid sick leave, and that's a travesty. And I think this crisis is, once again, bringing that issue to the front and center. We have been fighting for years to get employment recognition for gig economy workers, and I believe that it's now becoming front and center, that we need to have these employment protections for gig economy workers, and the fact that they can't afford to stay home. They can't work from home when they're out there. If they're feeling sick, they're not only a danger to themselves, but they're creating a danger to
And Shannon, so just to get a sense of the industries that because we're talking about gig economy workers.
Spreading this even further.
Yeah, so we're talking about gig economy workers. What industries specifically? What kind of businesses? What is this? Is this restaurants, childcare, drivers?
Well, when people talk about gig economy workers, they're thinking mostly of the drivers out there, the Uber and Lyft rideshare drivers, the food delivery drivers, Amazon drivers. Amazon drivers are out there right now delivering packages to people who are stockpiling supplies and food in their homes. And they're crucial to what we're doing right now, but if they feel sick, they need to be able to stay home, but they frequently can't. They usually can't. They need to go to work in order to get paid. So this is only going to be fueling the crisis further if these workers don't have paid sick leave.
So, Greg, let me come to you then, because you've been very diligent about following the government's advice. You are in self-isolation, but can you afford to be?
Absolutely not. So I could apply for employment support allowance through the benefit system, but that would only pay me £74.35p. I'm not entitled to sickness leave, sick pay, as I'm not employed. I'm a gig worker. So it is going to leave me very, very tight. And if I have to isolate for longer than the 7 days, should my symptoms worsen, then I'm not quite sure what to do. The company I work predominantly with, Deliveroo, they have announced that they will be supporting drivers through what's called a rider support fund. But in order to access that, you need to give medical proof. And now, as the 111 service is no longer issuing certificates and you can't get one from the doctor, there's no proof, so I can't access the fund.
What would you have done before if you, if you had the flu or you got a cold or some sort of bug? You wouldn't be I mean, you wouldn't stay at home. I mean, this is, you're following government advice right now, but usually if there was something wrong, you would just keep working, would you?
But I probably would do, yeah. As I'm a push bike courier, generally very fit and healthy, it's very rare that I actually come down with anything anyway. But if it was a case of this was just a cold or a flu, then I probably would still go to work. But knowing dangers to the vulnerable and the elderly, I've chosen to stay at home.
Vicky, just listening to Greg there, I mean, whether you're talking about the US or the UK, or indeed emerging economies as well, in strictly economic terms, is low wage or gig economy work always going to be a source of economic vulnerability?
Well, it will be. I think increasingly, because of this crisis, we're going to start focusing on that and seeing what needs to be done for those workers. But of course, we're not just talking about the gig economy, which is made up of people who, by definition, the way that it's developed, they depend on some digital platform to be able to do their work. Actually, there's so many self-employed people around. And it's not just low-paid people, it's also people who do a little bit better, but who have absolutely no access to any benefits if they themselves are ill. And of course, right now, with the way in which the coronavirus is affecting so many firms, the first people who will be let go are going to be all those subcontractors, self-employed people, while the firms try and still keep the ones who are permanently employed somehow on their payroll, possibly with government help. It will be really everybody else who has got quite used to working in a certain way, but making up for the fact that they don't have some of those benefits because of greater flexibility, because they quite like the work that they do, because they're able to add some of that gig economy stuff to everything else they're doing, part-time, delivery, bicycle drivers, and so on.
I mean, does it just apply to Western economies? Because I think in China you've got around, what, 50 million possibly in a population of 1.4 billion that are well off. So these are people that can basically afford to have a crisis. They can afford higher prices. They can just absorb higher prices for food and medical supplies and maintain their lifestyles. So I mean, even in a country like China, are people going to be left impoverished after what's happened?
I think you'd see that everywhere. But of course, quite a lot of other people will lose their jobs as well. So people who are in permanent employment. So there's no guarantee that they're going to keep their jobs. But I think there's one interesting thing about the types of crises that we've seen in the last decade when we had the financial crisis, but also wars. And actually, this one is going to be a little bit like that, which is that it is a bit of a leveler because, yes, of course, the gig economy workers are going to suffer, but there's going to be so much already. There has been so much wealth which is being wiped out. That what you find in those times is that, in fact, inequality gets reduced, but unfortunately, in real terms, in terms of poverty, that increases as well. And I think that's what we need to be watching, that a lot of the
poverty level will go up as well. And is that globally across the board?
The interesting thing is it's not going to go up in relation to average wage incomes, which is the way that poverty is calculated at present, because everyone will be shrinking. So that's OK. You may actually find a reduction in poverty. But in real terms, what you're going to end up with is loads of people in proper poverty when they can't afford the basic essentials that they need.
Shannon, is there a sort of social economic culture of just kind of working when you're sick? I mean, paid sick leave helps, but then it also has to be enough because, you know, I guess a couple of days off at minimum wage just doesn't cut it.
Well, I mean, it makes a big difference. Studies show that where workers have access to paid sick leave that they can actually make use of, it makes a difference. It keeps workplaces healthier. It helps improve worker productivity, and it's now vital, of course, to keeping us all safe. So in the U.S. right now, the Congress is considering a bill that would provide national sick leave. I mean, this is a historic opportunity, really, because this has been something that workers have been pushing for years and years, and now it may be on the brink of happening.
But it excludes millions of people, doesn't it?
Most notably because it applies to employees. Correct. It applies to employees, and of course, the entire gig economy. These workers are not acknowledged to be employees by these.
Shannon, I want to ask you about. I want to ask you about that House of Representatives. What action is being taken? I want to get into that with you, but just in light of what we've been talking about, the dilemma now facing a lot of workers who, if they continue working, they're vulnerable, so they want to obviously continue working because they need to survive, but also if they do so, they risk spreading the virus. Greg, have you thought, I mean, I don't like to ask you this question, but have you thought about what would happen if you did contract the virus?
I would certainly be really poorly. I can't confirm whether I have or haven't got it right now because I can't get tested. In order to get tested, I need to be admitted into hospital. So if I did contract the virus, I was off for longer, myself and my family would be left destitute. I've recently had a newborn baby. My partner's on statutory maternity pay, which pays a pittance anyway. So I really don't know what we would do.
Vicky, I suppose the thing with social distancing and a lot of us staying at home is that, we need people, perhaps like Greg, to go out and actually do stuff for us. So will a lot of companies and self-employed workers, whether it's, cab drivers, grocery delivery, that sort of thing, even perhaps plumbers, I don't know, will they see an increased demand for their services?
In theory, they should. But what is happening, of course, in the UK right now is that if you're trying to have a delivery to your home, you find that it's impossible to even get through. The system sort of crashes. And actually, you're advised not to go into it at all. You just can't do it because there's been such demand that it's being rationed very, very heavily. And there are all sorts of people saying, actually, it's a bit of an inefficient process. You order, you have someone else who packs the things and then brings them and uses petrol and and the time it takes for that to happen. So I think temporarily we might see that, in fact, people are encouraged to go out and do these things directly. So it may not lead to this increase that we think we may be getting just for that. But of course, once you get self-isolated, that's when we need these people. Now, if they fall ill, that's the real problem.
Right. And so, Shannon, what about there in the US? Because it could be a good thing for gig economy couriers who'll be called to deliver food and other essentials to self-isolating households when the virus reaches its peak, as Vicky was saying. So they could make lots of money from this, but it's also worrying if those people start to get sick themselves.
Yes, that's right. And also, studies show that restaurant workers go to work even when they're sick, because if they don't have access to paid leave, they have to do it in order to survive. And of course, that creates a tremendous risk for the public. And that's going to be only exacerbated now if gig economy workers aren't protected. And some of the measures that we have seen that are being announced require, for instance, the House bill would require the workers to be diagnosed with coronavirus in order to be eligible. And of course, that is not going to be a real solution here because testing is so scarce. The recommendation, the public health recommendation now is that if you are feeling sick at all, if you're feeling the onset of any symptoms, you should stay home. But unfortunately, for so many workers, that's really just not an option.
And Vicky, so there's some action being taken by the House of Representatives in the US. And then also here in the UK, there was a recent announcement from Boris Johnson about payments for workers, for people from the first day off rather than the fourth if you're affected by coronavirus. But that's useless for people like Greg, isn't it?
It's absolutely true. And the other help that has been given is statutory sick pay is generally paid for by the firms themselves. And of course, lots of small firms just can't afford that, especially if they're going to be losing loads of people. So the government here has taken on the job of paying that statutory sick pay themselves for 14 days. 14 days may not be enough. And once that's over and one loses one's job, which is the most likely thing to happen, then I think all the people who find themselves in the gig economy right now are going to find themselves sort of added to by where they are by all these people who lose their jobs anyway, simply because they can't be still be employed by all these firms that we're seeing.
Greg,
so it's going to be a bit of a leveler again.
So Greg, tell me, I guess people like you are not getting anything from the UK government's recent pledge on statutory sick pay. How disappointed and worried are you about this?
It is disappointing. I think there are conversations that need to happen, and I think they should have been happening many years ago. And it certainly shouldn't have taken this crisis for those conversations to start happening. But there's still no assurance from the government as to how we're going to be able to afford to survive through this. We don't know how long it's going to last for.
Shannon, I guess that the bottom line is that with companies themselves are always going to be hesitant about offering worker protections or even these kind of additional provisions during the coronavirus outbreak because of ongoing legal battles in which they argue that workers are not employees. That essentially is going to dictate the response, isn't it?
Well, so much. I mean, for years, again, we've been pushing to get these employment protections for these workers, and these companies have been trying to push this message that they've created a new world of work, that in the 21st century, we don't need all of these old-fashioned 20th century employment protections. But I think a crisis like this shows that we need those protections now more than ever.
Is that realistic, Vicky? Because we sort of, with the growth of the gig economy, we live in a world where actually a lot of companies want to distance themselves and make it appear as though they are very disconnected from their employees for legal reasons.
Well, the truth is that you can now work very differently than you did before, including work from home, which improves productivity. So there's been a bit of a change in that area. But I think what has been happening is that, A, there's been a bit of an outcry in terms of the way in which people in the gig economy, if you want to call that, are being used and possibly exploited. And there's been some changes. So some of the firms now have to accept that the people who work for them, particularly if they just work for them, are permanently employed or somewhere in between permanent and gig economy, so they can have some of those rights. But there is, I think, another issue which is really important, which is that there is regulation which is now developing to think about whether those companies are a transport company or a retail firm or something else, and they have to then fall into what is expected of them in terms of behaviour, how they employ the people and so on. I think that's the way in which it needs to move, to just make them change the way in which people are used.
I want a final word from all of you on, well, the prospects for reform. I suppose if there's one good thing to emerge from this, it's that it is casting a spotlight on vulnerable workers and the precarious situation they are now in. Shannon, I mean, just picking up on what Vicky was saying there, is the outcry a good thing? Could it ultimately lead to less exploitation?
Well, I hope that this crisis does lay bare the immense inequity that we're seeing. And that could be a silver lining if, in fact, we get some kind of federal paid sick leave on our books here. And also, in the courts, we've been battling for years. Today, I'm filing motions in order to get Uber and Lyft to be required to recognize their drivers as employees in a couple of states here in the United States where we have strong employment protections and strict rules about misclassifying workers as independent contractors. And I'm hopeful that we will succeed and that more of this country will recognize the importance of extending those protections to these vulnerable workers who need these protections now more than ever.
Greg, what about you? Do you have some hope that any good could come out of this?
I do. This crisis has highlighted a problem, and that we're in a bit of a social crisis with workers that are just completely incorrectly categorised as self-employed. We are workers, and we should get access to basic benefits from day one. That is full contractual sick pay.
Vicky, briefly, is this the wake-up call that we've been waiting for?
I sincerely hope so. I think if we are beginning to see loads of people sort of getting into that position, socially, just is going to be quite unacceptable. And there have already been some changes in the UK, and one hopes that perhaps one of the very good things, few good things that may come out of the current crisis will be that.
All right, well, thanks very much. Really appreciate it. Greg Howard for joining us from Nottingham, Shannon Liss-Riordon, and of course, here with me in the studio, Vicky Price. And thank you for watching as well. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Maryam, Nemazee, and the teams here in London and in Doha, bye for now.